Okay, good afternoon for all people who participate here. I'm Rimdas Laužikas from Vilnius University, and actually I'm interested in communication of cultural heritage, about how heritage works for different social groups, for different target groups, how heritage knowledge and heritage objects are interpreted, translated, created stories for general public, and actually archaeological heritage and archaeological knowledge form an important part in communication of cultural heritage.
Thank you. And then we have Susi.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Susi Thomas. I'm an associate professor at the University of Helsinki in Finland. So my country affiliation is Finland. And I am very interested, particularly in non-professional engagements with cultural heritage and especially with archaeological heritage. Partly for that reason, I'm the deputy leader of Working Group 3, which you've heard about earlier on today. One of my particular interests is metal detectorists, and at the moment I have a project in Finland where we're developing a citizen science platform to enable detectorists to report their discoveries, similar to schemes in the UK and other places. That's it for now.
Thank you. The next one would be Amber.
I'm Amber Cushing. I am currently a lecturer assistant professor at University College Dublin in Dublin, Ireland. So Ireland's my affiliation. And my work and teaching has to do with digital curation, education, and work. And that's sort of the interests that I come at this with. As I think I said briefly before, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm an information scientist person, but I do have interest in digital collecting and also the maintenance of digital collections. And of late, I'm doing some research on how artificial intelligence can be used for arrangement and description in archival collections of photographs.
Excellent. Thank you. Then we have Jeremy.
Hello there, I'm Jeremy Huggett. I'm Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Glasgow. So my affiliation is UK, perhaps more importantly though Scotland. I've been the Deputy Chair of Working Group 4 on aspects of digital scholarship. And that I guess arises out of my long-term interest in digital archaeology. I've been working in digital archaeology since the time it was called computer archaeology for some 35 years now, with a particular interest in the way the digital mediates in our creation of archaeological knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And then finally we have Costis.
Well, my name is Costis Dallas, and I share antiquity with Jeremy. I mean, our antiquity in the field. I mean, first met, I remember, in the Research Center for Computer Archaeology in Stafford many, many years ago. I teach in the University of Toronto. I'm an associate prof there, and my interests are very, very much in practices, scholarly practices, but also information practices that can become cultural as well. So I'm interested very, very much in how pervasive technologies somehow sort of meet archaeologists and meet archaeological knowledge, and how archaeological knowledge and curation evolves in the wild in these interactions between pervasive devices in the eCurators project, in which I am a PI. But I'm also interested very much in social digital memory, and especially how archaeological heritage and other kinds of material heritage contribute to our notions of identity and alterity, how they shape our ideas about the past and heritage. So this is the kind of range of interests that I'm working on at the moment. The last one in a project called Connective Digital Memory in the Borderlands, in which I work with colleagues in Vilnius University.
Great, thank you. And my name is Istu Huvila, and I'm chair of course ARKWORK. and professor at Uppsala University in information studies. And my research is very much about how archaeologists are creating, using, managing information and research data more lately. Okay, but now we can go to the actual discussion. And my first question for the panelists is that why research on archaeological practices is important, or is it important or useful somehow? And if we start in maybe in reverse order and give Costis the word first. Oh, now we have missed Tonya, please. Sorry.
Oh.
Okay, I'm Andrea Davidovic. I'm a cultural anthropologist doing studies on archaeological fieldwork, knowledge production, kind of ethnographical studies of this for quite some time. So that's why I'm also leading Group 1 for archaeological fieldwork. And currently I'm at Heidelberg University, leading a project about public participation in archaeology. So doing research on also metal detectorists, but also on excavation, working with volunteers. So also the Group 4 and Group 3 is very interesting for me. So, but then I would give over to Costis to answer the question.
Thank you. Sorry, Antonia.
Okay, I can start.
No problem.
I've been involved in the project in our network. I've been involved very much with working Group 3, which is the archaeology and the global communities, and that really opened my eyes to how archaeology can be important, and archaeological heritage can be important for questions such as, for instance, our sense of locality and where we belong, for people, for communities. It also becomes important in some cases through its meaning-carrying value. Archaeological objects and archaeological realities and places do carry this kind of possibility of meaning. So it becomes important for things like national identity or collective identity. And what are the collective identities? In Greece, I've been experiencing, for instance, all the controversies about the use of the Star of Vergina in the royal tombs of the Vergina, which is in Greek Macedonia. Of course, it was this like chest that was found, and this was then made the central symbol for the flag of North Macedonia, for instance. So it's all these things that really relate archaeology with meaning making, and especially with consequences for people's lives, that I'm very much interested into. And I think that the way that materiality becomes really important. It is really very much exemplified by cases such as, for instance, the controversy in North America about the monuments and all the story in Eastern Europe about how to deal with the material evidence, the material past, the material, sometimes archaeological as well, past, that really becomes part of contemporary archaeology that has to do with the Sovietization, for instance, in the Eastern Bloc, and how to deal with all these places. We know it anywhere from ISIS, we know it from our own context, and we know it also from history. And whatever now is mediated in this area is not just the immediate relationships that people can have with their material past, but also the way that this is mediated through the constructed nature of archaeological knowledge. So official archaeological knowledge, how it is exemplified canonically, comes and intervenes in this realm. So I'm interested in this interplay between institutional and non-institutional, the grassroots and the top-down kind of discourses, state discourses, governmental discourses about archaeology, the kind of stuff that Lynn Meskel and others, of course, has opened our eyes to several years ago.
Good, thank you. Would you like to continue, Tonya, with a question?
Yeah, I think it's very important to do research about archaeological knowledge production, because I'm coming from science and technology studies, where you have seen that it's very important to see how knowledge is produced, and to know what are you doing when you produce your knowledge. So, and at least in Germany, my impression is that it's not very often discussed. It's still a very kind of traditional way of seeing as an objective thing what is coming out of fieldwork. So especially in Germany, I think it's very important to bring this perspective on into the knowledge production. Also, as I said already in the morning, into the teaching and learning how to do fieldwork. So that's why I think it's important not only for us to know how to produce knowledge, but also when we present this knowledge to the general public or other disciplines that show the ambiguities and limitations of the knowledge. So.
Thank you. Then maybe Jeremy.
I agree. I mean, I think we're all very aware of the sort of environment in which we live, socially and politically, with all this fake news, post-truth kind of talk going on. And I think in those sorts of situations, as Costis says, it becomes all the more important for us to be able to say where our knowledge comes from and how we have arrived from at it. And I think, again, to pick up what Tony was saying, you can come at it from an educational perspective as well, which is, if you can't actually explain how you've done something, you can't teach somebody to follow on. Only, well, I suppose you can do it by rote, but that's not a particularly knowledgeable way of proceeding. So in a sense, the two areas are actually, I think, quite related. It's important to know how we've arrived at what we've arrived at in order to be able to justify what we've done in an environment in which we are increasingly open to challenge. And I think that makes understanding and reflecting on our practice extremely important at the moment.
Very true. Amber.
So I think I come at this a little bit differently. Again, not being an archaeologist, I feel like I've said that so many times the past 4 years, but I think it's interdisciplinarity is really important, because specifically if you're in information studies, it's a field that's incredibly interdisciplinary. And so it's really important to understand how different fields do things. Because there is a lot of overlap of issues, and a library might be struggling with the same kind of issue as an archaeology museum or a museum with archaeological collections. So there's a lot of overlap there. So my interest, and and why I think it's important, is because we don't want scholarship to become siloed, and we don't want any kind of what we know about knowledge work to become siloed. So it's really important to understand how different fields attempt to do some of that work.
Excellent points, definitely. Susi, please.
Hey, I guess a lot's been said already on this, so I don't want to repeat everyone, but I will sort of react a little bit to some of the things that have been said, and I totally agree with Jeremy and Tonya that it is very much to do with how we communicate and how we can show that archaeological knowledge, if it's done in a certain way, is valid knowledge and not fake news or something else. Coming at it from the community side, and this echoes also a little bit some of the discussion we had in our working group breakout room earlier, it's also acknowledging the knowledge that others would have. And particularly, for example, I work with metal detectorists a lot, which are controversial figures for various reasons within the archaeological community, but they're also sometimes, at least, actually quite knowledgeable and arguably more knowledgeable on certain aspects of archaeology, for example, artifact identification and so on. So I think part of the spectrum is also appreciating the archaeological knowledge production that's done by so-called non-professionals and where that fits within to the bigger scheme. And just to give an example, again, from our working group deliverables, we've made a special issue with Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage, which should be moving along soonish. The group I was involved in with that was involving also Emilin Axelsson from Norway and Vykintas Vaitkevičius from Vilnius, Lithuania, I should say. And we did a web focus group with metal detectorists, and it was very clear that they have very specific ways of using digital tools that are, some of them are created for archaeologists, some of them are ones created by the state, if you like, for them, but they're also creating their own softwares and using approaches in sometimes surprising ways, and they have their own vocabulary for the way they talk about these things. And I think in order to engage with the public, whether it's niche groups or others, we have to understand how other people perceive archaeological knowledge production and how they also contribute to that or perceive their own contribution within that. So yeah, I think this kind of research is crucial, basically.
Excellent point there as well. Rimras, would you like to comment?
Yeah, it's a lot of things just discussed, but actually I would add one additional thing to this. I think that when we talk about how archaeology works for society, and if you look to this from some social point of view, we need to think about some kind of researchers' social responsibility. In a lot of cases, our researchers, we are financed by public money. This means that society pay for our work, and we need to inform a society about our results. But in some situations, we choose an a little bit arrogant way. We say that I will inform in a way which is applicable and interesting for me. And if you will not apply my knowledge, if you not need for pure informational way, it's your decision, and I am not interested in you and in your needs. That actually, if we are really socially responsible persons, and if we want to cover more as possible social groups with our communication, social groups who are interested in archaeology, we need to know about these groups. We need to know about his informational behavior. We need to know how they perceive knowledge. What are their needs to knowledge? But actually, I think that understanding of knowledge work, of archaeological knowledge work in society, is a very strong, helpful tool for us when we want to be a socially responsible archaeologist.
That's a very, very good perspective to discussing and understanding archaeological practices and knowledge work, definitely. Now I would like to pose a question to all of the panelists, and you can freely choose to reflect upon it in the order as you like. You may kind of maybe wave your hand over whatever you think that works best. What about digitalization? What is kind of true impact? We've been talking about archaeological practices and knowledge work in the digital environment, and that has been kind of sort of debated throughout the years, that what's how digital we are and how much we're actually discussing about the digital thing or digital era or digital environment. But where does it come in, and why it's so special? Don't be shy. I know you aren't.
Well, I guess I would start by coming back and saying, well, why do you necessarily think it is special? Why should archaeology see itself as being particularly special in terms of digitalization? You know, are we actually any different than any other community or group studying in various areas? Now, having said that, I think there are certain aspects in which we are different, not least the sort of interdisciplinarity that Amber referred to a moment ago as a subject. And I think, you know, there are certainly areas in which you can look at the impact of the digital, but they tend to be quite specialist, I think. You know, Rachel was talking about it this morning in terms of you know, site prospection, using those sorts of techniques, and you know, any number of different sort of very specific areas you can sort of point the finger and say, well, yes, that's significantly affected by the use of digital tools and technologies. But whether you can necessarily say that archaeology itself has been transformed by the digital, I think is actually open to question.
Fair point. Susi, please.
Yeah, I'm not going to say too much on this topic, but I suppose one thing with archaeology is that actually a lot of things have been digital for quite a while. We've had a debate within University of Helsinki because we teach digital humanities now. We just started a degree program. We've been looking for where it sort of exists within humanities, and it's been very clear, and our archaeological colleagues have said, well, we've been doing this since at least the 90s, when you look at the different tools that get used for different types of field work, maybe not as extensively as now, but it has always been, or at least for quite a long time, been a component, which I suppose is why it's also interesting to try and look at also from ethnographic perspectives and so on of how people are interacting with it. I think there are probably potentially skill issues, and as Jeremy said, there's these sort of specialist areas that maybe only certain people can do. But then again, we've always had like a ceramic specialist and an illustrator on site. It's also quite normal for archaeology to have specialisms and specific skills within the sort of gamut of what counts as archaeology. I suppose another area that's quite interesting to look at now is just the openness of data, how much information is shared, and an open question which several of us are looking at as a sort of side project is how much people, and I know something also with your ERC that you're interested in, is how that data gets used. Is it's being served up, but does it actually get used, and who's using it? Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. More reflections about digitalizing. Costis, please.
And just add to that, I think that's digitalization, and I say digitalization or digitization in order to sort of broaden it, not to mean just the practical dimensions of scanning stuff in order to make a digital surrogate out of some kind of archaeological primary object. More broadly, the implications of the digital on archaeology are quite significant on various levels. For instance, for archaeology and archaeological theory and archaeological methodology itself. I mean, we know that one important question that really comes time and again in discussions of archaeological theory is how the so-called fossil record, archaeology as stuff out there, right, that is been deposited, that is at the ground, is transformed into informational record in a way, into something that then can have value in terms of meaning making, in terms of knowledge, etc., etc. My feeling is that the digital turn really comes and affects, not in a revolutionary way, but certainly it comes really to intervene in this kind of transformation in ways that are peculiar and are interesting. But it also does other things. It generates new configurations in terms of how research communities operate, in how archaeologists that are part of a research community interact with others, other stakeholders in the broader enterprise of archaeology that also involves other things like cultural resource management, for instance, right? Or public interpretation and public communication, all that aspect of public archaeology as well. So I think that there are implications there that are important and interesting. And my real question, at the time in which we know that meaning making and the shaping of expertise and the shaping also of ideas about reality and truth are dramatically inflected by the way that especially social media, social network sites operate today. And we witnessed that in all these last couple of troubled years in the political history of the West and world's history, really. In that case, I mean, what this poses really the more general question, I mean, how archaeology operates within the digital communication realm as a societal force. And I want to say something provocative in order to provoke discussion, really, by just paraphrasing Eric Hobsbawm, the historian. He's wrote about this about history, but I'd say about archaeology. I'd say, is archaeology to toxic nationalism, to xenophobia, to all these terrible phenomena, the same as opium agricultural production is to heroin distribution and use? That's what he said about history. And sometimes I cringe at the thought that archaeology can be this kind of negative force. So I think there are things there to be discussed that really have to do also with digitalization as a way, not just to alter the way in which we represent the world, but the way in which we communicate and make meaning now under the guise of infrastructures that tend to somehow sort of wield back agency from humans in ways that we haven't thought possible even a few years back.
Fair point. We're going to a general discussion in a short while. And I've had. Does anybody of the panelists still have an additional comment on this topic?
Actually, I think that continuing Costis' idea about importance of digital archaeology. And if you're following the approach to society, that actually, by my opinion, for me, is one of interesting things is regulatory changes, because archaeology and archaeology-connected fields, they are regulated by a lot of different legal regulations, including international, national, I don't know, regulations inside of different associations. And actually, we follow and we're investigating a lot of changes in archaeological practices, a lot of changes inside of archaeology, but how it inspire and broader field regulatory changes, how it inspire the changes in legal practices in different countries. Because actually in a lot of countries, when we talk about a lot of legal practices, for example, in practices of conservation of cultural heritage, that using of digital technologies or using of technologies like, I don't know, artificial intelligence, 3D scanning, we are absolutely not included into this. And one is need to preserve some building and some heritage objects that heritage professional is coming here and they're looking what are the changes in this object. And another interesting thing, I think that if you talk about importance of archaeology for general society, about social networks and similar things, that probably the question about social exclusion or about some social stratification of people who use this or not use this could be discussed and could be investigated here.
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very interesting point, definitely. Now, before going to the general discussion with the audience, I would like to ask all the panelists a kind of a question about where we are now after working 4.5 years with Cost ARKWORK. Partly kind of what do you think that where we have got, what has happened, and then also where should we go hereafter? Something, what could be the next steps? What we still don't know, what we haven't solved, even if we have been working hard and having in-depth discussions on many topics.
I can jump in.
Please.
So I think, just from my perspective, that certainly one direction could be a little bit more focus on interdisciplinarity, as far as new avenues for maybe research or education, and what the EU offers in light of that, different programs, because there is just a lot of demonstrated overlap. So one thing that always frustrates me is when I see knowledge kind of contained in silos and how damaging that can be. So I think looking at things from a wider perspective of maybe communicating with other fields and what other fields can bring in or take from archaeology and digitization and things like that might be one way forward.
That's definitely a very interesting idea and useful, considering, for instance, our group here.
I think one of the things that struck me, I mean, this morning gave me an opportunity to sort of go back over our original objectives, and it struck me revisiting those that we were hugely ambitious from the outset, and I think one of the things that has become apparent is that in a way we've barely scratched the surface. I think, to put an optimistic spin on it, we've perhaps laid the groundwork, at least in a number of key areas to do with sort of infrastructures and communities and things like that. But there is now so much more to do, and if anything, we've perhaps become much more aware of how much more there is. And I think a theme that's been coming through, Amber's just mentioned it, it was mentioned in our work group discussion this morning as well, is the fact that there is this need for greater interdisciplinarity and a greater awareness that other people are asking similar questions, not necessarily identical questions, And we would benefit a great deal from sharing information with them. In terms of ways forward, obviously, as well as sort of looking for those interdisciplinary links, it seems to me that having laid that groundwork, this is where people like Tonia's expertise comes in. I think we've got to the point now where what we need are some really good, solid sort of ethnographic case studies of exactly how this stuff actually works, because we can talk about it. I certainly have talked about it a great deal at length in theory, but actually looking at it in detail in practice would be extremely valuable. And it's only really been done in a few areas. Matt Edgeworth did a little bit some years ago, looking at people, the effect of people working on screens as opposed to in sort of physical reality. Mary Layton has also looked at aspects of this as well, and we heard about some of these projects in on Shifting Grounds conference. So I think developing some of those areas is one of the ways forward for us in the future.
I just add something to that. I fully agree with everything that was said, and especially with the last bit by Jeremy, that we need research that really goes out and looks at the field, and we need humble research. We need humility because we don't know much, and it's important that we go out and give the podium to our interlocutors, the participants in our research, rather than try to theorize too early, explain things too early, just take our theories and go over the field. And I think the key issue here is really how to achieve that in a way that is plural and that allows a multiplicity of approaches and a multiplicity of voices. And I think that we've got different kinds of research. Clearly, there's ethnography and ethnographic research there. There's other kinds of research that are qualitative as well, like interviewing research is another area in which we can work. But there's also different kinds of research that come from different disciplinary assumptions. I mean, myself, I appreciate greatly the kind of work that Anna and Amber had presented earlier today, for instance, because I feel that what we need also is somehow to reintegrate perspectives which see very, very much the whole idea of practices that relate to using behavior of people in relation to information, how they posit information, what they do with it, but also what their motives are, where they come from, why they do it. I think this kind of research as well is very, very good. Some could be questionnaire research. It could be like even quantitative research. Somewhere where we haven't been too, I think, successful is really producing this kind of ground in which people who are espoused with specific methodological traditions are able to go out of these methodologies. And that includes myself. I mean, I don't need anybody else, right? All of us to go out of these and be able to sort of find each other in a middle ground and be able to understand other methods. And this is doubly important because there's archaeologists and there's non-archaeologists in our community. And this is as it should be. I think this design decision was the right decision. And we did well to try to build that broader community. So building bridges, that's why I changed my background there.
Great, thank you. Tonia.
Yeah, maybe I can just add a comment on what Jeremy and Costis already said with this ethnographic methods that we are also seeing in digital environment. New methods are also developing. I mean, the ethnographic way of participant observation on an excavation is easier to follow and to be part of a discussion and the work. And how are we translating these methods now into the digital environment, for example? There are some new developments like walkthroughs that people explaining software and how to use it, or kind of auto-ethnographic approaches that you are doing the job by yourself. You are learning a method and reflecting at the same time how you are learning it. And it's also in cultural anthropology in general and with the STS approaches, science and technology studies. There's a lot of discussion, of course, about how to do ethnographic research in a digital environment. So I think this is an exciting area and there are new developments all the time. And what I'm also very interested in is the agency of these new practices and technologies. I mean, we had the discussion, of course, on the conference in Shifting Grounds, and it's coming up all the time. But there are so many new actors, material actors and agents in the field with so many new ways of agencies, and how we handle this agency. I mean, you know, as I said, we discussed this a lot, but I think this will be a topic which we will continue to discuss, because it's changing also the idea of agency. When it was started in science and technology studies, there were not so much digital practices around in the 70s and 80s, and now it's more, it's switched more or less to the digital as the main part. So I think this is an exciting discussion which we can contribute as well.
Absolutely. Susi?
Yeah, just to respond and reflect, I'm totally agreeing with the comments already, and what Jeremy said about we just scratch the surface. That's also a little bit, I suppose, the nature of cost actions, isn't it? That we have resource when it was possible back in BC before Corona to meet in person, that we could do that, and there were STSMs, but doing more extensive research is a little bit more challenging. But I think the value of this kind of network has been finding potential partners for those future research. It's helped us identify the questions. I hope also it means that we can be reactive quickly when calls come in the future that we see a space in for what we're interested to do. And for me personally, I think the way that my own professional network has developed because of this, and the people I've got to know also outside of archaeology, and as Costis said, there's also it's made friends, but it's also introduced other methodologies or other ways of using methodologies that I would never have thought of on my own or with my usual sort of network. So it's been really invaluable for that, and I think it's fine that we scratch the surface, because it just shows what a rich vein is below that surface and how far we can go, hopefully, in future.
That's definitely quite true. And as good research, so even if this has been collaborating, yes, doing research, meeting new people, networking, so definitely we have been asking and beginning to ask many more questions than we had in the beginning, even if we probably were very ambitious. And but it's good to be ambitious. Then you don't necessarily kind of get there, but you get far, and you get farther than if you're not trying to be ambitious enough. But now, at this point, I would like to ask also the audience members to ask questions or comment, reflect upon what has been discussed so far, or in the general theme of archaeological practice and knowledge work in the digital environment. And then panelists have an opportunity to reflect upon the questions or comments and so on. And please use the raise hand feature you can find behind reactions down on your screen to ask for a possibility to say something. It's easier to keep track on everybody of you that way, because I can't really see you all. And if there are no questions or reflections at the moment, so okay, now we do have Peter, please.
Yeah, hi. I'd be interested in seeing the panelists' opinions. When you reviewed the way digital technologies are affecting knowledge production archaeology, to what role did you find scale played an integral part of this? So, you know, if you're a small project or a small company and you're only deploying a limited range of technologies in your investigations, your interaction or the feedback loops of how that technology affects your working practices are going to be limited. But did you find, as you add more technologies to that investigation, to that project, are they changing the working practices in different scales, or as the scale and complexity of the technology that you're applying increases, does the scale to which it affects your working practices increase accordingly, or is it exponential? You know, are there positive feedback loops in the way these things interact with the workflows that magnify their impacts as you know, deploy more and more of them?
I'm happy to start. One of the reasons that, and I briefly mentioned this earlier this morning before I had to leave to teach, we decided in our workshop and working group to focus on small archaeological collections. And that was specifically because in early discussions, the problem seemed to be more, I don't want to say more difficult, but certainly have more like stopping points from potentially moving forward with digital for smaller collections because of these issues of scale, not being well resourced, or collections being small and maybe not necessarily garnering a lot of attention, maybe not having a lot of staff members associated with managing the collection, things like that. So we certainly see, scale playing a part there. And one of the things we tried to address in having this workshop about small collections was to just get people together to try to see kind of what works. Because at least on the small scale, it's more of like, it seems to be more of almost a trial and error and getting people together to talk about what works for them and what might be able to be replicated in somebody else's unique experience. Where I think if you're a big, well-resourced collection, and everybody can say, well, nobody probably admits to being well-resourced. Everyone says they're not well-resourced, but that's a matter of perspective, of course. But it's, there are different, at least with the collections, like some collections might be seen more as leaders because they are well-resourced, they have a reputation, and certainly it's going to present a different issue for them, especially if they, and Anna talked about this in our breakout, if they see themselves as kind of like leading the pack and feeling the pressure to innovate. So there are all of those types of things, but what I would say is, as far as when scale comes in, the issues kind of look a little bit different as far as like what is the most pressing issue associated with digital for you, depending on the size of your collection versus, you're going to have a different set of issues associated with that if you're of a different size.
That's quite excellent point.
I think Amber touched on the question of resource in relation to scale. And certainly my perception is that actually is quite a significant issue in archaeology, particularly with the sort of smaller organizations. It's actually very difficult and it can be quite expensive to get yourself set up and equipped and fully sort of digitized. And I think even now we're seeing there's quite some considerable lag between some of the larger organizations and the smaller organizations. That's fundamentally a resourcing issue as much as anything else.
If I thought of something else because this is that I just want to come in with. So one of the things I do in my work is I do work with Microsoft Ireland a lot, and some of you have been able to come and enjoy their food and their beautiful facilities, which they let us use sometimes, which is part of that relationship. But one of the things that's interesting in the conversations I have with them is that Microsoft's a giant tech company, right? But they sort of don't understand how to talk to smaller organizations, particularly nonprofits and heritage organizations. One of the reasons why I have a good dialogue with them is because I kind of explain these things to them and because they want to learn how to talk to these organizations and provide solutions for these organizations. And that's kind of some of the partnership that I've tried to put together, for the working group. But I think that in order to see maybe more scalable solutions, there needs to be some engagement with maybe the people who provide these solutions, right? Because I know if I look at libraries and archives, a lot, if you want to trace the history of what they've done with digital preservation, a lot of it has been the big guys aren't for us. So we're just going to have to come up with our own open source bootstrapping tools, and we're going to put our energy in that, and we'll never be able to put a computer programmer on staff or anything like that, so we're just not going to be able to afford it. But at least in my work in looking at artificial intelligence is starting to be offered as a suite of services, more like this piecemeal thing where you don't have to pay for this giant artificial intelligence service. tech companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon are trying to sell you like access to 1,000 images for like 1 cent an image or something like that. So there is sort of recognition, we're starting to see more recognition of these issues of scale that like fields, nonprofit fields have been talking about for like 20, 30 years now. So I would just say that as part of maybe trying to address some of those issues of scale, it's really being open about what the issues are and being, and like, I don't want to say shouting from the rooftops, but like just really being clear, like if you are talking to a tech company or this like giant company that wants to sell you this like humongous thing, just be like, no, that actually isn't what I need. This is what I need. So if you ever offer this, just let me know, because they actually do find that feedback really useful. And I think it can kind of move the conversation forward.
That's a fair point. Absolutely. And it's there's this kind of a tendency maybe to kind of see that, okay, the small are kind of they have problems in dealing with the big ones, but it's actually the other way around, and the understanding of scale in the both sides can be equally problematic. Now we have a comment or question from Henriette, please.
Sorry, it's a bit on and off. Yes, my question sort of comes from the fact that in the beginning of the ARKWORK project or network, I was a member of both working group 2 and working group 3. Yes, that's correct. And then for various reasons, the last couple of years, I haven't been around very much. But one of the things that I was thinking a lot about today in the working group session with Amber also, and then that I would like to ask the panel members about is how do you think the potential could be perhaps for in future work combining sort of the efforts of working group 3 and 2 in terms of because we talked a lot about sustainability of these online collections, and I'm starting to believe that more and more that what really will make them sustainable is having these users, especially users or wider user group, so also including the non-professional users and the community users, and also understanding exactly what kind of use could they have from these collections. And I think there's a great potential there in merging some of the knowledge from both these working groups in understanding how can we actually make collections of archaeological information that is sustainable and is used long term. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Thanks. I could make a quick comment if that's okay. This is actually partially from the working groups here, but also from my own personal experience. And I think especially when we think about sustainability and making sure as technologies evolve over time that collections remain open and remain true archives in that sense. I think there is, and this is probably something for other aspects of archaeological work, I think it's partially a skill issue that the people responsible for these archives aren't always relying on outside developers, or that they don't necessarily understand exactly what's happening or what the software is. And I think that's a major problem, not only, and maybe not necessarily so much, I don't know, in community-run grassroots archives, but certainly in even in sort of official authorized heritage management settings, it can be a major problem. And I think that's a challenge as we sort of start to intersplice traditional archaeological skills and knowledge with digital knowledge and software and so on. So I think that's one issue that we would need to think about in terms of sustainability, would be how to upskill or how to ensure that sort of next and new generation are able to respond to these challenges.
Great, thank you. Then we have a question from Kai. Or yes. Comment maybe.
No question, comment in a sense. Just I want to have your impression on I think a huge question that is coming is the fact that digital industry and companies, of course, in the ways they produce software, in the ways they manage information, they will have also maybe interest in the big archaeological data that is already being created in most of the countries. And the question is now, of course, open science is our way in a sense, but then what about the misuse of this data? Because we know this is a fantastic question. And of course, there the question is, what about the discourse on the data and etc. I want to have your opinion on that. And if you are facing that, this is not only to spot the fact that Microsoft or Google is doing that, but it's I think, a major question for us in the future.
Can I just ask, when you say misuse, do you mean things like building, like training systems based on the data, as far as like misuse based on like as an ethical question, or more blatant misuse?
Long series of possible misuse. One of them is, of course, the creation of discourses without professionals and human scientists, in a sense. And there we entered this very large question of misinformation, fake news, reconstructing another past, or cancel culture, what you want. Okay, a fantastic ocean of discussion. Of course, the ethical question, and then, of course, personal questions in terms of creation of human groups, the question of nation. It's a very huge question. But then, as we are entering in connection with industries and these companies, I'm asking if you have already some thoughts on it.
I think that it's a question about the market. Because actually, if we think, or if we discuss the question about how to sell archaeological data for somebody, or how to sell the archaeology for somebody, that actually I think that we think about maybe two things. One is actually connected with our research on archaeology interested communities, because we can position these communities as possible market groups, as possible people who will purchase, or for which we could sell our data. But actually, on the other hand, is that ethical questions, because in some situations, archaeological data they could be very applicable. Actually, they could be very sellable, and community could need for this, but it will not so ethical to sell archaeological data for them communities, because they could be connected with criminal communities, with criminal people, or with radical people and similar things. That actually, by my opinion, is two sides of this question. Is question about ethics, about archaeology ethics, and next question is about markets and interesting groups in the market.
I should add something very quick to quote Guy's question. I think one important dimension of this is not just only what is represented, because I mean, I think the risk in viewing, in moralizing somehow archaeological knowledge into resources that are atomic and then can be made into content and be promoted, sold, used. This underlies also our common use of the word user, right, in order to indicate who are the people who are going to be the beneficiaries of any kind of thing that happens. I think the real danger there is like how and who has the voice in order to be able to identify and curate and make the selections of what is viewed. There was recently quite a lot of vivid discussion in Twitter and other places about, for instance, the selection of sites that goes into the Google Cultural Institutes, the Google, Art and Google, the cultural project, in which they've got all these. Why these sites? And what happens the moment that there are different voices, like subaltern voices that have different views of us? How are these going to be expressed? And I think these are not reasons for us to, somehow turn away from these questions. Quite the contrary, there are issues for us to be engaged with them, because this is really where platforms and platformization on one side, and even fundamental issues that have to do with, for instance, the precarity and the ethics of care that has to do with the archaeological profession itself as another dimension that we haven't talked much about in this discussion. I hope that it will come up in the second group as well. I mean, how do you protect people's expertise? How do you build that expertise? And also, how do you allow this multiplicity of voices? I think some of the questions are really to do with how we use the tools and how we task the tools and what we do. But some of the issues are going to be policy issues or ethical frameworks that need to be operated in practice. And I think this is one area that we really need to turn to as well. This area of shared ethics of care and how this applies to these new digital practices.
I think just to add to that, and going back to one of the conversations we had in our breakout rooms, was that perhaps we need a broader definition of the term use. And maybe in developing a broader definition, it actually needs some boundaries as to what borders into misuse. Because that kind of encompasses a lot of maybe concerns about ethical uses and also the value of expertise, and also kind of who has the power to do the organizing as far as, you know, in Google Arts and Culture. I mean, in my experience talking to organizations, like Google just does whatever they want to do. If they want to highlight a certain collection, then that's what they do. And it's very much based on their preferences. Of course, that may not be completely transparent to someone who is visiting their site. And it does take kind of power away from who we want, you know as the experts to make those kind of decisions. So again, perhaps, and again, this goes back to Henriette's point of combining working group 2 and 3. Perhaps we just need a new and broader definition of use, but also maybe one of maybe misuse or questionable use, or maybe it's like a spectrum of use. And like there's one end at the end where, you know, there's different extremes.
Thank you. Now I have to, Colin, you were waving your hand at some point. Did you have a question or comment you would like to make or ask the panel?
Were you saying Colin?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Oh,
Jim.
okay. Sorry.
No,
yeah, you know, a lot of the time you see people talking about, well, we're not going to digitize this because we don't have the budget to be able to 3D model it or put it online or get programmers in to process it and everything. And I think that there's a moral obligation to over document as much as we possibly can. If we look at the disasters we've had in the last few years, ranging from the National Museum in Brazil to Notre Dame to even 2 weeks ago, a motorcycle museum in the Alps that burned to the ground. If we over document these things, if we have all of the, actually just the images, and we don't know what to do with them, we might know what to do with them later on. We might be able to recreate things that we can't recreate right now. Certainly being able to, going from an anthropological look, the Brazilian museum, not only did they lose massive amounts of artifacts, but they also lost the tapes of languages that are now, they were the only copies and they're gone. And so when we have say a site director or an FR8 that they don't want to get into a big project, at least if we can over document what they have, that then we can use it later. The museum in ancient Corinth was robbed in the 90s, and traditionally they would take 3 shots of every item, and Sotheby's was selling one of the stolen items, and they were presenting the opposite side of that object, which would never have been found had not the site director seen the Sotheby's catalog, and Interpol came in and found all of the artifacts. So, you know, for the cost of doing 100 photographs as opposed to 10,000 photographs, it's negligible compared to what we lose if we don't do it. I go to sites year after year that one year there's an inconsequential wall, but next year that wall's gone and it could have been used for something. And if we've got a lot of the foreign schools are schools of classical studies, and so they go down into the Roman and the Hellenic, but they dig through all of the Byzantine, and it's gone unless you have really good documentation of it and not just a few shots saying, well, this was the village that was on top.